Let me ask you something. When a student leaves your class at the end of the year, what evidence do they take with them? It's not the grade on the report card and definitely not the score on the final assessment or that number. You know, that number that gets passed along to next year's teacher in some cumulative folder somewhere, that one that you never look at. What evidence does that student carry with them in their own hands and in their own words that tells them something true about who they are as a mathematical thinker? I've noticed something in schools. Grades will tell a student where they landed, and that's useful information, but landing somewhere isn't the same as traveling somewhere. And most students don't have any real record of the journey, nothing tangible or personal to hold on to. There's the moment. We all know the moment. There's a moment in October when a concept finally clicked after weeks of confusion since September. There's the strategy that a child invented in November that they've never tried before, or the question in January that ended up changing how the whole class thought about a problem, and a dozen other moments like that scattered across the school year that just vanished. They happened, and they were real, and they counted as actual evidence of mathematical growth. Most of them disappeared the moment the unit ended and the next one began, which is really sort of the problem. That's the gap that the math journal fills. And it fills it in a way that grades just can't, because a journal isn't a verdict handed down at the end. It works more like a witness. It catches the students somewhere on the road, not just at the finish line. And over months, across a whole school year, it starts to build something close to proof. Proof that the child who couldn't explain their reasoning back in September can explain it clearly, even beautifully, by April. Proof that the struggle was real, but the growth was real too. And that student is a mathematical thinker in a way that no letter grade has ever managed to show. Welcome to Show Me the Math Receipts. I'm Asali Smith, founder of Number Navigators, and this is episode 10. Now, if you caught episode 9, we talked about making mathematical thinking visible, right? Now, if we think about it, the journal is where the visible thinking lives. Less a single snapshot, but more of a whole album building up. And today we're going to get into how to build one that actually gives something back. So let's get into it. But first, over to you, Josh.
It's time for Math Joke of the Day. Which knight created the round table? Circumference. Ba-dum-bum. Ching!
Thanks, Josh. All right, let's go. Let me tell you what a math journal is not, because there's a version of it that shows up in a lot of classrooms, and it's doing very little of what a math journal is capable of doing. It's the composition notebook where a child copies down vocabulary words. It's the spiral where the record of steps or an algorithm after the teacher's already taught it. Or the binder where finished worksheets get pasted in and called a portfolio. The exit ticket pile that nobody ever looks back at, or a handful of other variations that all land in the same place. Those things aren't math journals, they're storage. Storage has a place, but it doesn't build mathematical identity. It doesn't hand students evidence of their own growth, and it doesn't create the conditions for reflection. Without real, structured, mathematical, focused reflection, a journal is just more paper in a backpack, taking up space. A real math journal is a thinking space. It's a space where students work through ideas that aren't finished yet, where they get to ask questions they don't know the answers to. Sometimes they're explaining their reasoning to themselves And in doing so, actually understanding it more completely. And sometimes they look back at something that they wrote 3 weeks ago and think, I see this differently now. That moment, recognizing your own growth in your own handwriting, is one of the most powerful mathematical identity experiences that a student can have. So a journal isn't really a product, it's a practice. And like any practice that's worth building, it has to be taught, structured, and returned to again and again. Skip that part, and it turns into the exact kind of busy work that gives journals a really bad name in schools where somebody tried it once, got nothing, and then quit. Now, there's a good amount of research on reflective practice in mathematics education, and it connects directly to some of the work that we've talked about on this show before. Sandra Scher and James Curry, they looked at metacognition, that's where we think about our thinking, in middle school mathematics. And they found that students who regularly did structured mathematical reflection, writing about what they understood, what confused them, what questions they still had, showed noticeably greater conceptual growth over time compared to students who did the same amount of math practice without that reflective piece. The reflection wasn't replacing the math, of course. It was deepening it, because putting your mathematical thinking into words forces you to be honest about what you can actually understand rather than what you can execute on autopilot. There's also a connection to mathematical identity worth pulling here. James Paul G's work on identity and learning found that people build stronger identities in a domain when they have access to what he calls identity texts, records of their own thinking and growth that they can go back to and actually recognize themselves in. A math journal kept up over time works as exactly that kind of identity text. This is how I think, and this is how my thinking has changed. And somewhere in there, evidence that I'm becoming something. That's not a small thing for a child who's been told one way or another that they may not be a math person. Don't let me hear that again. The journal hands you evidence that you've actually been thinking mathematically, and evidence is a lot harder to argue with than a label. And then there's the formative assessment piece, which is something Dylan Williams' research keeps circling back to. Teachers who have ongoing access to student thinking make better instructional calls than teachers who only see that thinking at assessment moments. A journal gives a teacher a window into how students' understanding develops across weeks, instead of just how they happen to perform on one particular Tuesday. They start noticing patterns, catching confusion before it hardens into a real gap, celebrating growth specific enough to actually land with the child hearing it. That's what a longer view buys you. Now let me show you what this looks like when it's working. And then I'll show you what it looks like when it's not. Because the difference really matters a lot, and it almost always comes down to structure. Take a prompt like this one. Write about what you learned today. Kids write 2 sentences, tops. And most of those sentences just restate the lesson title back at you. Nobody's learning anything from writing it, and nobody's learning anything from reading it. Now, compare that to, we solved 3 different types of problems today. Which one felt more confusing and why? What did you try when you got stuck? And what would you want to try next time? Now that prompt is doing a few things at once, right? It's asking students to actually discriminate between problems instead of just recalling them, to evaluate rather than just list. It also gets them reflecting on their own process, how they engaged with the work, not just what the work was. And there's a forward-looking piece built in, positioning the child as a learner still in motion, instead of someone who simply got it or doesn't have it. Storage versus thinking. A journal that builds identity versus one that collects dust on a shelf somewhere. Now, the most powerful journal practice I've seen in math classrooms is simple enough that you could start it this week. At the start of a unit, students write an honest answer to one question. What did you already know about this? And what are you not sure about yet? That entry, written before instruction happens, becomes a kind of baseline. It captures exactly what students are bringing into the learning, and it gives both the student and the teacher something to come back to later. At the end of the unit, they open back up to that same entry where they wrote that initial reflection, and then they write again, working through what they understand now that they didn't know before. What's still confusing? Maybe a question that's still hanging around. That comparison before and after in a student's own words is real evidence, specific and personal, of actual mathematical growth. When a child reads their own earlier entry and laughs a little, it's because they understand so much more now. That's the moment. That's a student recognizing themselves as someone who moved. Now, if you're a classroom teacher, there's one thing that I really want you to hear before anything else. You don't have to grade a journal. Can I say it again? You don't have to grade a journal. I want to say that because it's the kind of thing that stops most teachers from ever starting. The moment a journal has to be graded, it turns into performance. The children start writing what they think you want to see instead of what they actually think. And once that happens, the journal isn't a thinking space anymore. It's just another place to be evaluated. Low stakes for students, high information for you. That's the balance that we're after. So read it, respond to it, let the kids know you're taking it seriously, but resist the urge to put a number on it. The minute you do, you've changed what this is. If you're a math coach, journals are one of the most underused coaching tools that we have. And not just for students. When you ask a teacher to keep a brief reflective journal about their own instructional decisions, what they tried, what surprised them, what they want to do differently next time, you're building the exact same metacognitive habit that you want them building in their students. It's worth naming that parallel out loud in your coaching conversations because teachers who reflect on their own practice tend to be a lot more open to conversations about changing it. Now, if you're an instructional leader, when you look at your school's approach to mathematical assessment, what evidence do students actually have of their own growth over time? The evidence the student holds in their own hands, in their own words. If the honest answer is not much, that's worth a hard look, because kids who can see their own growth are kids who start to believe growth is even possible. And that belief, mathematical growth mindset, in its most concrete and personal form, might be one of the strongest predictors that we have for whether a student stays engaged with math at all. If you're a pre-service teacher, start your own journal. Start it now before you ever ask a student to keep one. A mathematics learning journal about what you're studying, what confuses you, what clicked today, what question is still nagging at you. You can't invite students into a practice that you don't understand from the inside, and a semester of your own reflective writing will probably teach you more about structuring student journals than a textbook ever could. So here we go, your Wednesday morning receipts. 3 things this week. First, start with one prompt. Not a whole system. Don't try to build the perfect journal structure before you even begin. Just pick one prompt and try it this week. Something like, what felt hard about today's math? And what did you try when it got hard? That's enough to start. See what students write, see what it actually tells you, and then build it from there. Second, make the before and after practice visible. At the start of your next unit, have students write down what they know and what they're not sure about yet. Stick a sticky note on that page and then tell them, we're going to come back to it. And then at the end of the unit, come back. Let them read what they wrote and then let them write again. Let them share what changed out loud with the class or in whatever form feels right for your room. Growth witnessed by a community lands differently than growth witnessed alone. And third, respond to one journal entry a week. Not all of them, just one. A real response, something specific enough that a child can tell you, she actually read this. You could say something like, I noticed you said this confused you, but what happened when you tried it again? Or, this question that you asked is one that mathematicians have actually wrestled with. So let's talk about it. Landing on a child who didn't expect to be heard changes what the journal means to them. It tells them their thinking matters. Children who believe their thinking matters do more of it. So let's bring this back around. A math journal isn't really a notebook or an assignment or some portfolio of completed work. Closer to a relationship between a student and their own mathematical thinking built across time in their own voice and backed by evidence that they can actually hold in their own hands. Built well and tended to consistently, that relationship produces something that no grade report has ever managed to give a child. Proof. Proof that they are mathematical thinkers, that their thinking has actually grown, that the confusion was real, and the breakthrough was also real, and the whole journey between the two actually happened. That proof belongs to the student. It changes how they see themselves in math in a way that outlasts any single unit, any single year. The receipt worth holding on to. Next time on Show Me the Math Receipts, we're going all the way back to the beginning, before the journal, before the strategy, before any of it. The foundation that determines whether any of these practices can take hold in the first place. Number sense. What it actually is, how it's developed, what happens to children when we skip that work and jump straight to procedure. I'm Sally Smith. This is Show Me the Math Receipts, and until next time, teach boldly, protect student thinking, and always keep your math receipts.